How did an eternal city with no direct access to the sea manage to feed a population of millions? The Romans didn't just build harbors. They challenged the gods of the sea themselves. By constructing structures that seemed impossible. They sank giant ships to create foundations and poured concrete mountains right in the middle of raging waves. This story is not about temples and gladiators, but about a titanic engineering struggle for the survival of an empire. Watch the video to the end to find out what secret ingredient made Roman concrete stronger underwater and how this recipe made it possible to build Portus, the greatest engineering marvel of antiquity. I will reveal to you the secret that determined the fate of Rome, and it is not the legions or the Senate. What if the entire power of the empire depended on a single capricious river mouth and food supplies? Rome was a giant city, a real monster, consuming enormous amounts of resources every day. This metropolis with a population of millions had long since ceased to feed itself, relying entirely on overseas territories. Its entire life, stability, and political tranquility hung by a thin thread of supplies stretching from Egypt, Africa, and Sicily. But getting the vital grain to the capital was the most difficult and dangerous part of the journey. The problem was that Rome was not a seaport in the usual sense. It stood deep inland on the banks of the Tiber River, which was its only connection to the Tyrrhenian Sea. Merchant ships that had crossed the Mediterranean could not simply enter the city and unload at the Forum. They had to overcome the last, most treacherous part of the journey. The mouth of the Tiber was notorious for its unpredictable currents and constant silt movement. This waterway was shallow and constantly changing. Ships loaded with hundreds of tons of grain had too deep a draft to enter the river. Captains simply refused to risk their ships and valuable cargo. They were forced to drop anchor in the open sea in an unsafe roadstead. This turned unloading into a real logistical nightmare. The cargo had to be transferred to smaller, lighter river barges capable of maneuvering in shallow water. This process was incredibly slow, expensive, and dangerous. The weather was another enemy of Roman supplies. The mouth of the Tiber had no natural protection from sea storms. A sudden southwesterly wind, known as the libeccio, could raise huge waves in a matter of hours. Ships anchored in the roadstead were torn from their moorings and thrown ashore. Hundreds of ships and thousands of tons of grain were lost every year at the very doorstep of Rome, which was not only an economic disaster, but also a strategic one. The state-bred distribution system, known as the annone, was the foundation of stability in the capital. Any disruption in supplies could have immediate consequences. The emperors were well aware of this threat and lived in constant fear of it. Failure to feed the urban population was a direct path to the loss of power. Therefore, solving the supply problem was not just an important task, but a matter of survival for the regime itself. For centuries, the first solution was Ostia. This small town located at the mouth of the Tiber served as the main transshipment base. However, Ostia itself was a river port that suffered from the same problems as the mouth of the river. It was cramped, congested with ships, and constantly silted up. Ostia's infrastructure was desperately unable to cope with the growing appetites of the capital. The city needed warehouses, docks, and most importantly, a safe harbor. Roman engineers tried to fight the nature of the Tiber, but the river always won. They deepened the bottom and built temporary piers, but silt and sand returned again and again. It became clear that attempts to improve the river port were half measures. The problem required a radical solution, unheard of in its audacity. It was necessary to stop fighting the river and challenge the sea itself. This vulnerability was shameful for a power that had conquered almost the entire known world. Mighty Rome, whose legions stood from Britain to Syria, could not guarantee the safe delivery of a sack of grain to its own capital. Every storm off the coast of Italy caused panic in the Senate. An empire capable of building aqueducts tens of kilometers long and giant amphitheaters did not have a proper seaport. Emperors reviewed projects one after another, but they were deterred either by the cost or the incredible complexity of the task. Building an artificial harbor on an open, unprotected coastline seemed insane. It required technologies that had not yet been invented and resources that could deplete the treasury. It took a ruler with enough courage or desperation to take such a step. This inability to provide logistics was Rome's real Achilles heel. It made the empire dependent on the whims of the weather and limited its economic growth. The problem was not conquering Egypt, but getting its harvest safely to Roman bakeries. Until this problem was solved, Rome remained a colossus with feet of clay. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how such a seemingly simple logistical problem could keep an entire empire in suspense? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about Rome's very first port? Ostia, located a few kilometers from the mouth of the Tiber, was the capital's main gateway for centuries. Founded, according to legend, during the royal period, it grew from a small military fortress into a bustling trading city. Its proximity to Rome made it an obvious candidate for the role of the main logistics hub. The whole life of the city revolved around the river and the ships arriving from all over the Mediterranean. However, Ostia was a port of necessity rather than convenience. It was not located on the sea, but on the banks of the Tiber, slightly above its mouth. This meant that it inherited all the problems associated with the river. The main one was silt. The Tiber carried a huge amount of sediment, which settled at the mouth, constantly changing its depth and fairway. The port of Ostia had to be literally dug out every year. For Roman engineers, this was an endless and thankless task. Teams of workers with primitive dredgers constantly deepened the bottom near the berths, but the river was stronger. During floods, it brought tons of new silt, nullifying all their efforts. As a result, the port remained shallow, and large sea vessels could not enter it. As we have already mentioned, they had to anchor in the open sea. Life in Ostia was hectic and stressful. The city was crowded with sailors, merchants, dock workers, and storekeepers. Narrow streets led to the river, where hundreds of small vessels crowded the wooden docks. These were shuttle ships that sailed between the large roadstead and the city. They took grain from the sea giants and carried it to the warehouses of Ostia. Then the same cargo was reloaded onto river barges, which were already pulling up the river to Rome. This system was not just slow, it was catastrophically inefficient. Each transshipment increased the cost of the grain, and worse, led to losses. The grain spilled, got wet, and was damaged by rodents in the warehouses. The entire process from ship to Roman bakery could take weeks. While a city of millions waited for its bread, the precious cargo was stuck in a logistical traffic jam in Ostia. The city's warehouses, or horea, were constantly overflowing. They stretched along the shore, but there still weren't enough of them. Ostia simply wasn't designed to handle the flow of cargo that the capital needed during the heyday of the empire. It was a port for a small city-state, not a Mediterranean superpower. Attempts to expand it were hampered by physical limitations. On one side was a river, on the other, swamps and salt marshes. In addition, Ostia was not only a port, but also a naval base. It was home to the fleet that defended the Italian coast. Military ships and merchant vessels shared the already cramped space. This created additional confusion and delays. In the event of a military threat, merchant shipping could be completely paralyzed, which would immediately affect supplies to Rome. The climate was also not conducive to the port's prosperity. The surrounding swamps made the air in Ostia unhealthy. Summers were hot and humid, causing food and storage to spoil quickly. Sailors and workers suffered from disease. Despite the wealth that passed through the city, it was not a pleasant place to live, but rather a harsh working settlement. Roman emperors tried to improve the situation. They built new warehouses and repaired the docks, but these were only cosmetic improvements. Augustus and Tiberius invested in the development of Ostia, but they could not solve the main problem, the problem of the Tiber estuary. The city desperately needed a real, deep water and, most importantly, safe seaport. Old Ostia was a living example of how the infrastructure of the past could not cope with the demands of the future. It was a symbol of the old republic, but it was completely unsuitable for the needs of the growing empire. But Ostia was only the beginning, a temporary measure that could not solve the problem. Are you ready to find out what crazy plan Emperor Claudius proposed to challenge the sea itself? What I am about to show you was considered impossible in the ancient world. By the middle of the 1st century AD, the problem of supplying Rome had reached a critical point. Emperor Claudius, who ascended the throne in 41 AD, faced this problem head-on. He was not a military leader, but rather an administrator, and he understood perfectly well that the stability of his power depended on bread. It was he who made a decision that his contemporaries considered absolutely insane: to build a giant artificial harbor from scratch north of the mouth of the Tiber. This project was unprecedented in its scale and audacity. Claudius's engineers proposed not to improve Ostia, but to abandon it completely as a seaport. They chose a location on a deserted coastline where there was no natural bay or any protection from the winds. Here on flat ground, they had to create a harbor capable of accommodating hundreds of ships at once. This meant that they would literally have to build land in the middle of the sea. The plan called for the creation of a huge basin covering hundreds of acres. To protect it from the sea, engineers had to build two giant curved piers extending far into the water. One pier was to run from the north, the other from the south, forming an artificial entrance facing away from the prevailing winds. Between the ends of the piers, it was planned to create an artificial island on which a lighthouse was to be located. It was the most ambitious construction project since the Egyptian pyramids. It required not only enormous financial costs, but also engineering solutions that did not yet exist. The main question was how to build these giant piers. They had to withstand the full force of Mediterranean storms while standing on unstable sandy ground. Any error in the calculations would lead to immediate destruction. It was here that Roman engineers applied one of the most extraordinary solutions in history. To create the foundation for the artificial island with a lighthouse, Claudius ordered the use of a giant ship. This was no ordinary vessel, but a veritable floating monster built under Caligula. The ship was specially designed to transport a giant obelisk from Egypt, which still stands today in St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. This ship was a marvel of shipbuilding. It was over 100 meters long, and an entire forest was required to build it. After completing its mission, it stood idle, too large for any practical use. Claudius's engineers filled the ship's holds with stones and concrete rubble. It was then towed to a pre-selected location between the future piers and ceremoniously sunk. This giant hull lying at the bottom became an indestructible foundation for the lighthouse. This act demonstrates both the pragmatism and incredible courage of Roman designers. They did not simply dispose of an unnecessary ship. They used it as a ready-made massive foundation block that would have been impossible to deliver to the site by any other means. This saved them years of work creating an artificial island from scratch. The very fact that such a valuable object was sunk shows how important this project was to the emperor. The construction of the harbor itself, named Portus, took almost 2 decades. Thousands of workers were involved in this titanic task. They dug out the soil, drove in piles, and most importantly, prepared millions of tons of concrete. The work continued day and night. Claudius poured enormous funds into this project, realizing that his legacy would depend on the success of this construction. His contemporaries, including the historian Tacitus, were initially skeptical of the project. They criticized Claudius for his extravagance and arrogance. It seemed that he was challenging the gods by trying to change nature itself. However, as the piers rose out of the water and the outlines of the harbor became visible, skepticism gave way to amazement. Rome was creating an engineering marvel before their very eyes. The new port was not just a mooring, but an entire industrial complex. Simultaneously with the construction of the harbor, a canal was dug connecting the new port to the Tiber. This allowed barges to pick up grain directly in Portus and take it to Rome, bypassing the unpredictable estuary. The system worked like clockwork, and Claudius, although he did not live to see the completion of the work, could consider his mission accomplished. Please like this video if, like me, you are amazed by the boldness and scale of Roman engineering solutions. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about the incredible technologies of ancient Rome. Are you ready to learn the truth about what allowed Rome to build all these wonders? The success of Claudius' project and all subsequent Roman maritime structures would have been impossible without one key invention. We are talking about Roman concrete, or opus caementicium. It was not just mortar, but a true high-tech material, the secret of which was lost for 1,000 years after the fall of the empire. It was this material that allowed the Romans to build where it seemed impossible, underwater. Ordinary mortar made from lime and sand does not harden in water. It is simply washed away by the current. The Egyptians and Greeks built their ports using giant, carefully hewn stone blocks. This was incredibly expensive, slow, and not very reliable. The Romans, however, invented hydraulic concrete, a material that was not only resistant to water, but also became stronger over time. The secret ingredient was pozzolan. This is a special type of volcanic ash that the Romans extracted in abundance from quarries near Naples, in the area of the city of Pozzuoli. This ash, essentially ground volcanic rock, was rich in silicon dioxide and aluminum oxide. Roman engineers discovered its amazing properties through empirical means. When pozzolan was mixed with lime and water, a complex chemical reaction was triggered. Unlike a conventional mortar, where the lime simply dries out, new, incredibly strong crystalline compounds were formed, calcium hydrosilicates. These crystals literally fused into a monolithic mass that was completely insoluble in water. In essence, the Romans artificially recreated natural stone. This material was a real gift for engineers. It was cheap to produce, as pozzolan and lime were readily available. It did not require highly skilled masons, unlike masonry made of hewn stone. Most importantly, it allowed for the creation of solid, monolithic structures of any shape and size. The Romans could cast giant blocks right on site. The Romans used several technologies to build piers and foundations in Portus. One of the most advanced was the use of wooden caissons. These were giant hollow boxes without bottoms, made of sturdy planks. The caisson was towed to the desired location in the sea and secured with anchors. Then the workers began to pour concrete mixture inside. As it filled, the caisson slowly sank to the bottom under its own weight. The water displaced by the concrete flowed out through the bottom. When the caisson settled on the bottom, the workers continued to fill it to the top. After a few days, the concrete set, turning into a single artificial reef. The wooden formwork rotted away over time, but that didn't matter. It was only a temporary form. This method allowed massive concrete piers and foundations to be built directly in the open sea. Engineers could build as fast as the logistics of material delivery allowed. They were no longer dependent on quarries and the weather. They could literally sculpt the landscape as they saw fit, creating harbors where nature had not provided a single bay. Roman concrete was so strong that many of these structures are still standing today, 2,000 years later. The piers at Portus, the harbor at Caesarea, all are testament to the genius of Roman engineers. Modern research shows that seawater, penetrating microcracks, reacted with the components of the concrete and formed new minerals that made the structure even stronger. This material changed everything. It gave architects a freedom they could not have dreamed of. Arches, domes, giant spans, all this became possible thanks to opus caementitium. But nowhere was its potential more evident than in marine construction. The Romans did not just tame the sea, they made it work for them, using it to strengthen their buildings. Now that the Romans had this miracle material, they had to decide how to use it on an unprecedented scale. In the next chapter, you will learn how engineers built giant breakwaters right in the open sea. Building an artificial harbor on an open coastline is, first and foremost, a battle against the waves. The main task for Claudius's engineers was to create two giant breakwaters, or moles, that would shield the inner harbor from the fury of the sea. These structures had to be more than just walls. They had to be massive structures capable of dissipating the energy of thousands of tons of water during a storm. The Romans approached this task with their characteristic grandeur and ingenuity. As we already know, the basis of the technology was hydraulic concrete. But how could it be delivered to the bottom and shaped as needed in conditions of constant sea surf? Simply dumping the mixture into the water would have been ineffective. Therefore, the engineers used a method that could be called layer-by-layer construction. They built the pier not as a wall, but as a chain of giant interconnected concrete blocks. The caissons mentioned earlier were used for this purpose, but dozens of such caissons were needed to build a long pier. Each of them was a complex engineering structure. First, work was carried out to level the ground at the bottom. Divers, using primitive equipment, cleared the site of large stones and debris. Sometimes a cushion of crushed stone was poured onto the bottom to create a more stable foundation. Then the first caisson was delivered to the site. It was a huge wooden box, the size of a small house. It was carefully anchored so that it would not shift during the pouring of concrete. After that, the process itself began. Barges loaded with lime, pozzolan, and crushed stone approached the caisson one after another. The mixture was prepared on site on special floating platforms and immediately unloaded into a wooden mold. The work required incredible coordination and speed. The concrete mixture had to be laid continuously, layer by layer, so that the entire mass would set as a single monolith. Thousands of workers were involved in this giant concrete mixer. They worked in several shifts, day and night, by torchlight. Any delay in the delivery of materials or error in the proportions could ruin the entire block. After the first caisson was filled and the concrete had set, the engineers moved on to the next one. The new caisson was installed close to the previous one, forming a continuous chain. In this way, the pier grew, meter by meter, extending into the sea. It was slow and painstaking work that required enormous patience and precise calculations. Each block had to be placed in its place with jeweler's precision. The upper part of the pier, which rose above the water, was particularly important. It took the brunt of the waves. Therefore, it was made even more massive, and the outer side facing the sea was often faced with giant stone blocks. These blocks served as additional protection, shielding the concrete core from erosion. A wide road was laid across the pier, allowing carts and construction equipment to move along it. The outer breakwater in the harbor of Claudius was not just a straight wall. It had a complex, curved shape, carefully calculated by engineers. This shape was designed to better disperse the energy of the waves. When a wave hit this curve, it didn't bounce back, but sort of rolled along it, losing its destructive power. It was a brilliant understanding of hydrodynamics. Between the two piers, north and south, remained the entrance to the harbor, but even it needed to be protected. To this end, as we remember, an artificial island with a lighthouse was created. It stood directly opposite the entrance, dividing it into two passages. This island not only served as the base for the lighthouse, but also functioned as an additional breakwater. It broke large waves before they could enter the harbor, creating a zone of calm water inside it. The construction of these piers was a real battle with nature. Undoubtedly, storms repeatedly destroyed temporary structures and swept away barges carrying materials. But the Romans stubbornly continued their work. They developed technology that allowed them to win this battle. They did not simply build on the coast, they actively shaped the coastline to suit their needs. What if I told you that Rome built an airport for ships 2,000 years before airplanes? When the titanic work of constructing the piers was completed, the Romans had a protected water area of more than 200 hectares at their disposal. This was Portus Claudius, Rome's first great artificial harbor. Its appearance changed the logistics of the empire forever. Now hundreds of ships could enter the safe harbor at the same time and drop anchor without fear of storms. The central element of the new harbor, its hardened symbol, was a giant lighthouse. It was built on the very artificial island created from Caligula's sunken ship. According to contemporary accounts, this lighthouse was one of the wonders of engineering, rivaling the famous Lighthouse of Alexandria in height and complexity. Its light was visible for tens of kilometers, guiding sailors. The presence of such a powerful lighthouse was critically important. It not only marked the entrance to the harbor, but also allowed ships to enter the port even at night. This significantly increased the port's throughput capacity. Captains sailing from Africa no longer had to wait for dawn, risking a storm, but could immediately head for the saving lights of Portus. The harbor itself was huge, but not yet fully developed. Under Claudius, the main focus was on creating a protective perimeter, breakwaters. The internal layout was simpler. Ships entering the harbor did not moor to stone piers, as we imagine. They still anchored in the center of the basin, and the cargo was transferred to barges. However, this process now took place in ideal conditions, in calm waters. There was no more rocking, risk of collision, or loss of cargo due to waves. Dozens of barges could calmly approach the sides of sea vessels and take on grain. This sped up unloading dozens of times over. Ostia's logistical nightmare was a thing of the past. A key element of the new system was the canal connecting Portus with the Tiber. It was named the Claudian Canal. Now barges did not need to go out to the open sea to get from the harbor to the river. They picked up grain in Portus and immediately entered the inland waterway that led straight to Rome. It was a safe, fast, and completely controlled transport artery. Infrastructure immediately began to grow around the harbor and along the canal. The first warehouses for temporary grain storage were built. Administrative buildings, customs offices, barracks for guards, and residential quarters for port workers appeared. Portus was rapidly turning into a new city, which in terms of its importance was beginning to eclipse the old Ostia. Ostia incidentally also found a new role. It remained an important river port and administrative center, but its function had changed. Now it was no longer the first line of defense against logistical chaos, but rather part of an overall system. The connection between Ostia and Portus was maintained by land and through a system of canals. The Portus Claudius was an engineering triumph. It solved the emperor's main problem. It ensured the security of grain supplies. Rome could breathe easy. However, as is often the case with mega projects, it had one serious flaw that only became apparent over time. The engineers defeated the storms, but they did not completely defeat the silt. The entrance to the harbor, although protected, was still prone to silting. The currents that flowed around the new breakwaters carried sand with them, which gradually settled in the water area. This gigantic port was a triumph, but even it had a hidden flaw. In the next chapter, we will discuss why, after only 50 years, it was necessary to build another, more perfect harbor. The Portus of Claudius was a real breakthrough, but it was not a permanent solution. Just half a century after its construction, it became clear that the project had serious flaws. First, the problem of silting, although reduced, had not disappeared. The entrance to the harbor was gradually clogging with sand and had to be cleaned regularly, which was expensive and difficult. The sea was reluctant to give up the space it had conquered. Secondly, although the moles protected against most storms, the strongest storms still caused problems. The huge area of the water meant that even inside the harbor, the wind could cause strong waves. It was unsafe for ships at anchor. In 62 AD, even before all the work was completed, a powerful storm sank about 200 ships in the harbor. It was a disaster that showed that the perfect port was still vulnerable. Emperors Nero and Vespasian continued the work, improving and expanding the port of Claudius. But fundamental problems remained. By the beginning of the 2nd century, under Emperor Trajan, the empire had reached the height of its power. Trade had grown many times over. Rome needed even more grain, even more goods. The port of Claudius, this giant, could no longer cope with the increased flow. Trajan was known for his grandiose construction projects, the Forum, the Column, the bridge over the Danube. He was a soldier and engineer who thought in terms of efficiency and durability. He did not simply repair the port of Claudius. He ordered the construction of a new port, an inland port that would be completely protected from both the sea and silt. Trajan's engineer's project was no less ingenious than Claudius's, but it was ingenious in a different way. They did not try to fight the sea. They decided to hide from it. The new port was to be dug deep into the land, east of the harbor of Claudius. It was to become a port within a port, an inner harbor connected to the outer basin of Claudius by a wide channel. This solution solved all the problems at once. The inner harbor would be completely protected from storms. Even if waves penetrated the port of Claudius, they simply would not be able to reach the inner basin. The problem of silting also receded. All the sand and silt would remain in the outer port, which now served as a giant sedimentation tank. The chief engineer of this project was the brilliant Apollodorus of Damascus. He was the one who designed the famous Trajan's bridge over the Danube. For the new harbor, he chose a shape that became its hallmark and the pinnacle of Roman engineering. It was a perfect hexagon. This shape was not chosen at random. It was dictated by pure mathematics and logistics. The hexagon allowed for the maximum length of berths to be placed in a minimum area. Each of the 6 sides of the hexagon was an ideal straight berth. Unlike a round or square shape, there were no useless corners or excessively long distances. Construction began around 100 AD. It was another titanic construction project. Millions of cubic meters of earth were excavated to create a 33-hectare basin. All the excavated soil was used to reinforce the banks and build foundations for warehouses. The banks of the hexagon were lined with stone and equipped with mooring rings. The new port, named Portus Traiani Felicius, Trajan's Happy Port, was a masterpiece of efficiency. It was connected not only to the harbor of Claudius, but also to the Tiber via a new system of canals. Now ships could enter the harbor of Claudius from the sea, move from there to Trajan's inner hexagon, unload at stone berths, and send cargo on barges directly to Rome. Trajan's new port was not just an addition to the port of Claudius. It was a new generation operating system that completely changed the logic of maritime transport. Its entire structure was subordinated to one goal: maximum efficiency in unloading and storage. The hexagonal shape was the heart of this system, but the genius of the project lay in the details. The basin was about 5 meters deep, which was sufficient for any, even the largest, sea vessels of the time. Each of the 6 sides of the hexagon was 358 meters long. This gave a total of more than 2 kilometers of continuous quay wall. Dozens of ships could moor and unload at the same time without interfering with each other. A wide paved embankment ran around the entire perimeter of the hexagon. This allowed carts and porters to drive right up to the ship's side. Unloading proceeded in a continuous stream. Immediately behind the embankment was the second, even more important element of the system: giant warehouse complexes, or horea. These warehouses were not just sheds. They were multi-story, solid brick and concrete structures built according to a single plan. They were designed to fit perfectly into the geometry of the port. Their facades faced the docks. Goods from ships were almost immediately taken inside the warehouse, bypassing long waits in the open air. Inside, the warehouses were divided into many separate cells. This allowed different types of goods to be sorted and stored. Grain in some sections, wine and oil and amphorae in others, spices and luxury items in others. The ventilation system was designed to ensure the preservation of food. These warehouses were real safes that protected the empire's wealth. Trajan's engineers also improved the canal system. The new Trajan's Canal was wider and deeper than the old Claudius Canal. It connected the hexagon directly to the Tiber, creating another more direct route to Rome. In addition, a whole network of internal canals was built to connect warehouses and docks. Small barges could enter the warehouse complexes directly for loading. This dual system, the outer port of Claudius for reception and mooring, and the inner port of Trajan for unloading and storage, was incredibly flexible. The outer port took all the brunt of the elements and served as a reception area. The inner hexagon was a sterile and highly efficient operating room. One could not exist without the other. Apollodorus of Damascus created not just a harbor, but an ideal logistics terminal. The geometry of the hexagon minimized the distance from any berth to the central canals and warehouses. It also helped to dampen any random waves that might penetrate from the outer harbor. The water in the hexagon was always calm, like a pond. This port became the economic center of the Mediterranean. Goods from all corners of the empire flocked here. Portus Trajanus was not just the gateway to Rome. It was its stomach, its bank, and its customs house. All of Rome's economic power was concentrated in this one perfectly planned place. The legacy of this construction is impressive. The outlines of Trajan's hexagon are still clearly visible today, almost 2,000 years later. It has turned into a small lake, but its perfect geometric shape can be clearly seen on satellite images. It is a silent monument to the engineering genius that managed to solve the most pressing problem of the eternal city for centuries to come. Even a port as perfect as Trajan's hexagon was only the first link in a complex chain. The task was not simply to bring grain to the harbor, but to deliver it to the storerooms of Rome. Therefore, the infrastructure built around Portus was no less important than the piers and berths themselves. The Romans created what we would today call an integrated logistics complex. The main element of this system was the warehouses, or horea. We have already mentioned them, but their scale deserves a separate story. The warehouses built by Trajan, Hadrian, and other emperors were gigantic. The complex known as the Great Horea was the size of a small city. It was not a single building, but an entire neighborhood consisting of dozens of buildings. These buildings were the pinnacle of utilitarian architecture. They were built of brick and concrete, which made them fireproof. The structure was designed to withstand the enormous weight of the stored grain. Inside, they were divided into hundreds of cells, each of which could be locked. This allowed for strict accounting and prevented theft. The floors in the grain warehouses were raised above the ground on special supports. This created a ventilated space that protected the grain from moisture coming from the ground. The walls also had special ventilation holes. Roman engineers did everything possible to preserve the precious cargo from spoilage. An entire city grew up around Portus. It was inhabited by thousands of people whose lives were connected with the port. Sailors, stevedores, storekeepers, customs officials, guards, and merchants. This city was planned as rationally as the port itself. Its streets were tied to the axes of the canals and warehouses. It was a real corporate city built by the state for its own needs. The second most important part of the infrastructure was the canals. The system of waterways connecting Portus with Rome was the lifeblood of the Annona. The main canal, the Fossa Traiana, was navigable. Heavy river barges loaded with grain flowed along it in a continuous stream. These barges, known as caudicarium, were the backbone of the river fleet. They had no sails as the current of the Tiber was too strong. They were pulled upriver with ropes. Special towpaths were laid along the banks of the Tiber and the canal. Dozens of oxen, or in some cases teams of men, slowly pulled the barges against the current for 20 kilometers to Rome itself. The system was slow but incredibly reliable. It worked like a conveyor belt. While one batch of grain was being unloaded in Portus, another was already sailing along the canal, and a third was being unloaded in the city warehouses of Rome. The process was continuous. It provided the capital with food every day, regardless of the weather at sea. In Rome itself, in the Testaccio district, was the final destination of this journey. Here were located the giant city warehouses, where grain arrived by barge. From here, it was distributed to bakeries and distribution points. The entire cycle, from the Egyptian fields to the Roman table, was organized with military precision. Portus and Ostia played different but complementary roles in this system. Portus became the main international hub for large tonnage cargo, primarily grain. Ostia retained its role as an administrative center and port for smaller, coastal shipments, as well as for the import of luxury goods. The two cities, connected by canals and roads, functioned as a single port complex. This complex and expensive system was not built for profit. It was built for survival. The Annona was a state subsidy program. Emperors spent fortunes to keep ports, canals, and warehouses operational because the cost of inaction was too high. The system created by Claudius and Trajan worked with incredible efficiency for over 300 years. Portus and Ostia reliably fed Rome even during the most turbulent times of the 3rd century. This well-oiled logistical machine was one of the pillars on which the late empire stood. As long as ships continued to arrive at Portus, relative order prevailed in Rome. However, nothing lasts forever. The decline of the great ports was not due to engineering miscalculations, but to the decline of the empire itself. In the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome began to lose its overseas provinces. First, Britain fell, then Gaul, and worst of all, in 439, the Vandals captured North Africa, Rome's main breadbasket. This was a fatal blow to the Annona system. The flow of grain that had fed Rome for centuries suddenly dried up. The giant ports, designed to receive fleets of hundreds of ships, were left idle. The population of Rome, deprived of free handouts and cheap bread, began to decline rapidly. By the 6th century, only a few tens of thousands of inhabitants remained in the once mega-city of millions. Portus and Ostia no longer had anyone to feed. Huge warehouses stood empty. The hexagon's docks, which until recently had been crowded with ships from all over the world, were deserted. The canals through which the barges sailed began to silt up, and no one cleaned them anymore. Nature slowly but surely began to take its toll. During the Gothic Wars in the 6th century, the ports became battlefields, which further accelerated their destruction. What humans did not destroy, time completed. The mouth of the Tiber, which the Romans had so stubbornly tried to tame, returned to its natural state. The river once again began to deposit tons of silt, gradually burying the greatest engineering structures of antiquity. Portus was completely abandoned. The harbor of Claudius and Trajan's hexagon turned into closed, swampy lakes. Old Ostia, also cut off from the sea by the changed riverbed, was deserted. Its inhabitants left, and the buildings were swallowed up by the earth. For 1,000 years, the great ports of Rome were practically wiped off the map from people's memories. Their rediscovery took place in modern times. Archaeologists and engineers studying the ruins were amazed by the scale and complexity of what they saw. Aerial photography in the 20th century clearly revealed for the first time the perfect outline of Trajan's hexagon, hidden under a layer of earth and water. It was a real revelation. Today, Portus and Ostia Antica are two of the most impressive archaeological parks in the world. A walk through the streets of Ostia gives an incredible insight into life in a Roman port city. And the view of Trajan's hexagon, even though it has turned into a lake, makes you stand in awe of the genius of Apollodorus of Damascus. The legacy of these ports is enormous. First, it is material evidence of the power of Roman engineering. Second, it is a lesson in the importance of logistics. The Roman Empire was built not only by legions, but also by engineers who provided food for these legions and the capital. The engineers who built Portus tamed the sea with a single material, hydraulic concrete. Their methods of constructing caissons and breakwaters were 100 years ahead of their time. It was only in the 19th century, with the invention of Portland cement, that people were able to approach what the Romans had been doing on an industrial scale since the time of Claudius. We see that the history of the construction of Rome's ports is an epic drama about man's struggle with nature and the titanic efforts to sustain the life of a giant metropolis. From desperate and ineffective attempts to use the mouth of the Tiber to the creation of the two greatest artificial harbors of antiquity, Portus Claudius and Trajan's hexagon. This path demonstrates the full power of Roman engineering. The secret of their success lay in two things: a brilliant invention, hydraulic concrete based on pozzolan, and the imperial will to spend unimaginable resources on these projects. The Romans did not just build docks, they created entire ecosystems from scratch, including piers, lighthouses, canals, warehouses, and cities. They tamed the sea to feed Rome. These ports are not just ruins. They are a monument to human ingenuity and perseverance. They remind us that the most impressive technologies are born out of the need to solve the most pressing problems. For Rome, that problem was bread, and the answer was ports that were unmatched in scale and complexity for 1,500 years. What do you think about these incredible structures? Which part of their design, the concrete recipe, the ship sinking, or the perfect hexagon, did you find most impressive? Suggest topics for future videos about ancient Rome that you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of the past.